Before the cup of espresso hit the floor, before the stack of contracts slid off the walnut desk in a slow avalanche of white paper, before the room full of dangerous men turned to stare, a voice near the doorway whispered something that no one in that building had ever dared to say out loud. "Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no. I am so, so sorry. I think I just broke your grandfather's photograph." The silence that followed was not the ordinary kind. It was the kind of silence that happens in rooms where silence means someone is about to stop breathing. 14 men in tailored suits sat frozen around a conference table. Not one of them moved. Not one of them blinked. Because the photograph she had knocked off the credenza behind the boss's chair was not just a photograph. It was the only image Cesare Ferrante had of his grandfather, Silvio, the man who had built the family's empire from a lemon grove in Palermo 70 years ago. The frame had cracked down the middle. The glass had splintered into 3 jagged pieces on the marble floor. And the woman standing in the doorway, holding a tray of espresso cups that were now missing one, had a look on her face that said she already knew she would not survive the next 30 seconds. But Cesare Ferrante did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He did not even turn around to look at the damage. He looked at the woman in the doorway, at the tray trembling in her hands, at the coffee stain spreading across the front of her blouse like a small brown country appearing on a map, and he said 5 words that confused every man in the room. "Bring me the pieces, please." The please was what did it, because Cesare Ferrante did not say please. He had not said please in a recorded conversation in over 20 years. His men exchanged glances. The woman in the doorway did not move. She stood there with her lips slightly parted and her eyes wide, and her left shoe sitting in a puddle of espresso. And she looked at the most feared man in the province of Palermo, the way a bird looks at a window it has just flown into, stunned, disoriented, and unable to understand how something transparent could be so hard. Her name was Mireille Catano, and she had been his secretary for exactly 47 minutes. The Ferrante estate sat 3 kilometers outside the village of Castellano, perched on a hillside that overlooked the northern coast of Sicily like a man surveying territory he already owned. The house itself was not a house. It was a compound. 3 connected structures built from volcanic stone that had turned the color of dark honey over the decades, surrounded by a wall that was decorative from the outside and reinforced from within. Lemon trees lined the gravel drive. Bougainvillea climbed the eastern wall in thick purple curtains that moved in the sea breeze. The air smelled of rosemary and salt, and the faint diesel exhaust of the 2 black cars that were always parked near the gate. Engines warm, ready. Inside, the compound was a study in contradictions. The kitchen was enormous, tiled in hand-painted ceramic, and always had something simmering on the stove because Cesare's mother, before she died, had insisted that a house without a cooking smell was not a house, but a tomb. The hallways were lined with bookshelves, real books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages. There was a courtyard in the center with a stone fountain that had not worked in 6 years, but Cesare refused to have it repaired because the sound of water reminded him of a time he did not want to revisit. The office where he conducted his business occupied the entire 2nd floor of the western wing. The floors were marble. The desk was walnut, built by a carpenter in Catania who had been dead for 30 years. The windows were bulletproof, though they did not look it. They looked like ordinary windows, and that was the point, because the most dangerous things in Cesare Ferrante's world always looked ordinary. 7 secretaries had come through those doors in the last 14 months. 7 women, each one more qualified than the last, university educated, professionally trained, multilingual, and every single one of them had quit. The longest had lasted 19 days. The shortest had lasted 3 hours. She had walked into the office on a Monday morning, seen a man named Tadeo Luca cleaning a firearm at the conference table, and walked directly back out without removing her coat. The reasons varied. Fear, mostly, not of Cesare himself, though he was not a man who inspired comfort. Fear of what moved through the house. The phone calls that came at 2 in the morning, the men who arrived with bruised knuckles and left with envelopes, the conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. The understanding, slow and creeping, that the man who signed her paychecks operated in a world where the word retirement did not always mean what the dictionary said it meant. Each secretary had been offered a salary roughly triple the market rate, and each, eventually, had sat across from Cesare and said some version of the same sentence. "I am sorry, Signore Ferrante. I cannot continue." He had never argued. He had simply nodded, thanked them for their time, and watched them leave. Then he had called his consigliere, a man named Dario Montecchio, and said the same thing each time. Find another one. And Dario, who had known Cesare since they were boys, throwing rocks at lizards on the walls of the old quarter, would sigh and say the same thing each time. Maybe if you smiled once in a while, they would stay. I am not paying them to be smiled at. No. You are paying them to answer phones and not faint at the sight of Tadeo Luca. And I am telling you, Cesare, there is not enough money in Sicily for that. Mireille Catano had not planned to become a secretary to anyone, let alone a man whose last name made taxi drivers change the subject. She had planned to become a veterinarian. That had been the plan since she was 11 years old, and had found a cat with a broken leg behind the fish market in Bagheria, and had splinted it with 2 popsicle sticks and a strip torn from her school uniform, carrying the animal home in her backpack while it yowled like a broken accordion. She had been good at school. Not the kind of good that came from discipline, but the kind that came from genuine, almost painful curiosity about how things worked, how bodies healed, why bones mended themselves, but hearts did not. She had earned a place at the university in Catania to study veterinary science. She had packed her bags. She had kissed her mother on both cheeks and promised to call every Sunday. And then her mother had gotten sick. Not the kind of sick that announces itself with a dramatic collapse. The slow kind. The kind that begins with a cough that does not go away, then a fatigue that sleep does not fix. Then a diagnosis delivered in a small gray office by a doctor who spoke in numbers and percentages that Mireille did not want to hear. Her mother, Hortensia Catano, had been 51 years old. She had worked as a seamstress in a shop near the cathedral in Bagheria for 23 years. She had hands that could thread a needle in dim light and a laugh that made strangers smile on the bus. She had raised Mireille alone after Mireille's father, a merchant sailor named Berto, had left for a job on a cargo ship when Mireille was 4 and had never come back. Not dead, just gone, which in some ways was harder because it meant there was no grave to visit. No ending to grieve, just an open door that let the wind in. Mireille had withdrawn from the university. She had come home. She had spent the next 2 years doing what daughters do when the world asks too much of them. She had held everything together with her hands while her heart came apart in pieces. Hortensia had died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in her bed, with Mireille holding her hand and the cat, the same cat from behind the fish market, now old and half blind, sleeping at the foot of the bed. There was no inheritance, no savings, and no safety net. There was a small life insurance policy that covered the funeral and left exactly 1,400 euros. What she did next was survive. She took a job at a dental office and was let go after 2 weeks for shredding a patient's file instead of the blank forms beside it. She took a job at a hotel and lasted a month before she tripped on the lobby stairs while carrying welcome drinks and sent 6 glasses of Prosecco cascading across the marble floor. She tried a flower shop. She overwatered the orchids. She tried a law office. She misfiled a court date. She tried a bakery. She burned a tray of cannoli shells so badly the owner said it looked like a crime scene. Mireille Catano was not incompetent. She was something more frustrating and more heartbreaking than that. She was a woman whose hands shook. Not always. Not visibly. But at the moments when precision mattered most, when the pressure of getting it right became loud enough to hear, her hands would betray her. It had started after her mother's diagnosis, a tremor born not from any neurological condition, but from the constant, grinding anxiety of a person who had spent 2 years waiting for the worst to happen and then watching it arrive. Her body had learned to brace for catastrophe, and now it braced even when there was none, and the bracing itself became the catastrophe. She was 26. She had brown eyes that were a shade too large for her face, which gave her the permanent expression of someone who had just been mildly startled. Her hair was dark and wavy and had a habit of escaping whatever clip or band she used to restrain it. She was the kind of height that made her disappear in crowds, which she did often, not out of shyness, but out of a quiet preference for not being the center of attention. A preference the universe seemed determined to deny her, because Mireille Catano was the most conspicuously clumsy person in the province of Palermo, and conspicuous clumsiness is the enemy of invisibility. When the listing for the secretary position had appeared, posted by Dario through a staffing agency, the description was vague. Executive assistant needed for private estate. Discretion required. Salary negotiable. Mireille had applied because the word salary negotiable to a woman with 300 euros in her bank account and rent due in 11 days sounded less like a job listing and more like a life raft. When Dario had interviewed her in a cafe in Palermo, he had looked at her resume, then looked at her, then looked at her resume again with the expression of a man reading a document he suspected had been written as a joke. You have been dismissed from 5 positions in 2 years. 6, Mireille said. I forgot the bakery. Dario studied her. Why should I hire you? Because I will show up every day. I will not complain. I will not steal. And I need this job more than anyone else who applied. Dario had leaned back in his chair. He had thought about the 7 secretaries who had quit, each one polished and composed and utterly incapable of lasting in a world that smelled like danger. And he had thought, perhaps, that what Cesare needed was not another porcelain figurine. Perhaps what he needed was someone who had already been dropped and had learned to pick herself up. You start Monday, he said. And so Mireille had driven to the Ferrante estate on a Monday morning in October, with her hands gripping the steering wheel and a feeling in her stomach like she had swallowed a small animal that was trying to claw its way back out. She had been handed a tray of espresso cups by a woman in the kitchen who said only, "Conference room, 14 cups, do not spill." She had carried the tray up the stairs with the concentration of a woman disarming a bomb. She had turned the corner. Her heel had caught the edge of the doorframe. The tray had tilted. 1 cup had slid. She had lunged to catch it, and her elbow had caught the edge of the credenza behind the boss's chair, and the photograph of Silvio Ferrante had fallen to the marble floor with a sound like a small bone breaking. And 47 minutes into her employment with the most feared man in the province, Mireille Catano stood in a puddle of espresso, holding a tray of 13 cups, staring at the cracked photograph of a dead patriarch, and wondering if the ground could please open and swallow her immediately. It did not. Instead, Cesare Ferrante said, "Bring me the pieces, please." Cesare did not look at the broken frame on the floor. He looked at the woman. Mireille knelt. She set the tray down, and with hands that shook visibly now, she began to pick up the pieces of the frame. She picked up the largest shard first and immediately cut her finger. A thin red line opened across her index finger, and a single drop of blood fell onto the marble floor beside the photograph of Silvio Ferrante. She did not make a sound. She pressed her cut finger against the hem of her blouse and kept picking up the pieces with her other hand, one by one, carefully, as if each shard were something precious. Because Mireille Catano, who had broken things all her life, had learned something that most people never learn. The moment after you break something matters more than the breaking itself. You cannot unbreak a glass, you cannot unspill a tray, but you can kneel on a marble floor in front of 14 dangerous men and gather the pieces without running, and that, in its own quiet way, is a kind of courage. Cesare watched her. His face showed nothing, but something behind the nothing registered the way she bled without flinching, the way she did not apologize again after the first time. When she had collected all the pieces, she stood and held them out to him. Silvio Ferrante's face, captured in black and white sometime in the 1950s, stared up from the pile of shards in Mireille's cupped hands. Cesare took the photograph gently, with 2 fingers at the edges. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he placed it face down on the desk. "You are bleeding," he said. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing. There is a first aid kit in the kitchen. Tell Agnès to clean it." Mireille looked at him. She was waiting for the rest. The firing. The fury. The cold dismissal she had received at every other job. But Cesare did not fire her. He turned to the 14 men at the conference table and said, "Where were we?" Mireille backed out of the doorway. She walked down the stairs. She reached the kitchen. She set the tray on the counter. And then she leaned against the cold tile wall and slid to the floor with her bleeding hand pressed against her chest and her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her teeth. Agnese, the cook, a woman in her 60s with forearms like loaves of bread and a face permanently arranged into an expression of skeptical patience, looked down at her. "You broke something," Agnese said. It was not a question. "The photograph." Agnese's eyebrows rose a full centimeter, which, for Agnese, was the equivalent of a theatrical gasp. "The photograph of Silvio." "Yes, and you are still alive. It appears so." Agnese cleaned the cut and wrapped a small bandage around the finger. Then she said, "His mother had hands like yours, always shaking, always dropping things." Mireille looked at her. Agnese's face had closed again, the brief window sealed shut. She returned to the stove where a pot of tomato sauce was simmering with the self-contained authority of something that would be ready when it decided to be ready. His mother. The word sat in the air like a door left ajar. And Mireille, who was not bold by nature, but who had the particular stubbornness of a woman who had already fallen down enough times to stop being afraid of the floor, almost asked. But she did not. She went back upstairs and delivered the remaining 13 cups of espresso to the conference room without spilling a single one. Cesare Ferrante had not always been the man the province feared. Once he had been a boy who was afraid of thunder. He had been born in a 2-room apartment above a butcher shop in Castellano, the second child of Silvio's youngest son, a man named Aldo Ferrante, who had inherited his father's ambition, but none of his restraint. Aldo was handsome in the way that concealed something rotten. He had a wide smile and elegant hands and a temper that ignited without warning. He drank grappa in the evenings. By the 3rd glass, his voice would change. By the 4th, the apartment would change. A chair would be on its side. A plate would be in pieces on the floor. And Cesare's mother, a woman named Pietrina, would be standing with her back against the kitchen wall, holding her hands up the way people hold their hands up when they are trying to stop something that cannot be stopped. Pietrina Ferrante had been a potter before her marriage, working in a small ceramics workshop near the harbor. She had small hands that trembled, not from fear but from a nerve condition she had carried since childhood, a tremor that worsened under stress. She had been beautiful in the quiet way that men like Aldo found intolerable, because quiet beauty does not perform, and men like Aldo needed constant reassurance that what they possessed was worthy of possession. He had hit her for the first time 3 weeks after their wedding, a slap across the face because the soup was cold. It had escalated the way these things always escalate, not in a straight line, but in a spiral, each revolution tighter than the last. Cesare remembered the sounds more than the sights. The sound of his mother's body against the wall, the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen, the sound of his father's voice, low and slurred and mean, saying things that a boy should never hear said to anyone, let alone to the woman who sang him songs about fishermen and stars. He remembered hiding behind the sofa, pressing his face into the fabric, smelling dust and wool and the faint ghost of his mother's lavender perfume. He remembered his older sister, Ginevra, pulling him into the closet and holding her hand over his mouth and whispering, "Do not make a sound." And he remembered his mother's voice, afterward, always afterward, standing at the sink with a wet cloth pressed against her face, and her hands shaking so badly the water dripped in a continuous stream, saying, "We are fine. It is fine. Your father loves us. He just has a difficult day. We are fine. We are fine." The same words, the same lie, passed from mother to child like a lullaby sung in a language that only the broken understand. Pietrina had died when Cesare was 12. Not from the beatings directly, though they had weakened her body in ways the doctors catalogued with clinical detachment. She had died from pneumonia that her body was too depleted to fight. A body that had been hit and healed and hit and healed so many times that the healing itself had become exhausted. Cesare had stood beside her bed in the hospital in Palermo. He had held her trembling hand, and she had said to him, in a voice barely louder than the hum of the machines, "You are going to be someone, Cesare. Promise me you will be someone who does not look away." He had promised. He had not fully understood what the promise meant, but he had carried it the way children carry things they cannot yet lift, awkwardly, heavily, with both arms. And when Aldo had come home drunk the night after the funeral and had stood in the kitchen and said, "She was weak. Your mother. She was always weak." Cesare, who was 12 years old and 90 pounds, had picked up a ceramic plate from the counter and thrown it at his father's head. He missed, but the throw itself was a kind of beginning, the beginning of a boy who would never miss again. His father had beaten him badly that night, badly enough that Ginevra had called their grandfather, Silvio, who had arrived at the apartment at 3 a.m. in a black car with 2 men who did not speak. Silvio had looked at his grandson's face, swollen and purple. He had looked at his son, Aldo, standing in the kitchen with bloody knuckles and a glass of grappa, and he had said 6 words in Sicilian dialect that Cesare would remember for the rest of his life. Words he would never repeat. Words that were not a threat, but a verdict. Aldo Ferrante left Castellano that night. He was not seen in the village again. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay closed, and the sound they make when they shut is the same sound as the beginning of a different life. Silvio had raised Cesare from that night forward. He had taught him the business. He had taught him patience, discipline, the difference between power and violence. Power, Silvio had said, is what you have when you no longer need to use your hands. Violence is what weak men use when they have nothing else. Your father was a violent man. You will be a powerful one. There is a difference, and you must never forget it. Cesare had not forgotten. But the thing he had never told anyone, the thing he carried in a hallway he had sealed shut decades ago, was this. Every time he saw a woman flinch, something in him moved. Not visibly, not in any way his men would ever detect. But it moved the way tectonic plates move, deep underground, invisible, and capable of rearranging everything on the surface without warning. He had seen Mireille Catano flinch when she broke the photograph. Not the flinch of embarrassment, the flinch of a woman who expected to be hit. He knew that flinch. He had catalogued it in his body the way soldiers catalog the sounds of different weapons. She had flinched, and in that flinch, Cesare had seen his mother standing at the kitchen sink, holding a wet cloth, saying, "We are fine." And something in that sealed hallway had opened. Just a crack. Just enough to let the light in. The first week was a catastrophe in slow motion. On Tuesday, Mireille answered a call from a man named Rosso, who spoke only in Sicilian dialect so dense it sounded like a different language, and she had transcribed his message as, "The shipment of lemons arrives Thursday," when what he had actually said was something considerably more dangerous and not remotely related to fruit. Cesare had read the message, looked at Mireille, looked at the message again, and said, "Lemons." She had nodded earnestly. He had folded the note and placed it in his pocket and walked away, and Dario, who had been standing in the hallway, swore he saw the corner of Cesare's mouth move. Not a smile. The ghost of a possibility of a smile. On Wednesday, she had reorganized his filing system with genuine enthusiasm and considerable effort. Color-coding folders, labeling drawers, creating an index card system. The problem was that she had reorganized it according to her own logic. Contracts were filed under P for paper things with signatures. Financial records were filed under N for numbers. Correspondence from judges was filed under S for scary letters. And an entire drawer of sensitive operational documents had been labeled, simply, important things that probably should not be left out. When Cesare opened the cabinet on Thursday morning and saw that label, he stood there for 11 seconds without moving. Dario counted. Then Cesare closed the cabinet and said, "Do not touch the filing system again." But here was the thing that Dario noticed, and that the other men began to notice, and that even Taddeo Luca, who noticed very little that did not involve a firearm, eventually noticed. She did not quit. She came back every morning. She arrived early. She made espresso, badly, using too much sugar, and not enough pressure so that it tasted like someone had dissolved a candy bar in warm water. She tripped over the threshold of the conference room so many times that Taddeo eventually placed a small piece of yellow tape on the floor to mark it, which was the closest thing to an act of kindness that Taddeo Luca had performed in approximately 15 years. And she stayed. On Friday of that first week, Cesare was alone in his office late in the evening. The compound had gone quiet. Mireille knocked on the open door. She was holding a cup of espresso she had made 3 times, pouring the first 2 attempts down the sink. "I made you coffee," she said. "You are still here," he said. It was not a question. It was something closer to an observation, the way a man might note that a stray cat he expected to wander off had instead sat down on the porch and stayed. "I told you I would show up every day," Mireille said. She set the cup on the corner of his desk, carefully, with both hands. "I am not very good at this job yet. But I am here. Why? Because nobody here yells at me when I break something." The sentence landed in the room like a bird that had flown in through an open window. Small, alive, and impossible to ignore. Cesare looked at her for a long time. His gray-green eyes did something they had not done in the presence of an employee in over 20 years. They softened. Not much. A fraction. The way ice looks different just before it begins to melt. He heard what she had not said. That somewhere, someone had yelled. That somewhere, breaking something had carried a cost higher than embarrassment. That the flinch he had seen on her first day was not just nerves. It was memory. "The espresso is improving," he said. It was the first kind thing he had said to her. It was also, technically, a lie, because the espresso was still terrible. But it was the kind of lie that tells a deeper truth. The truth that her effort mattered, and that she was welcome to keep trying. "Thank you, Signore Ferrante." "Cesare." She blinked. "What? My name is Cesare. Signore Ferrante was my grandfather." Mireille turned and walked toward the door. She did not trip on the threshold. She made it through cleanly, both feet, no stumble. and as she walked down the hallway, she heard something behind her so quiet it might have been the wind or the house settling or her own imagination, but it sounded like a man laughing, just once, just barely. The way a locked door sounds when the key turns for the first time in years. It happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into her employment. Mireille arrived at the compound 40 minutes early. She walked through the courtyard, past the broken fountain, up the stairs. She set her bag on her desk. She turned on the lamp. She began sorting the mail. And then Cesare walked in and saw her face. The bruise was on her left cheekbone. It was not large, but it was dark, a deep violet that shaded to yellow at the edges. She had tried to cover it with makeup. From across a room, you might not notice it. But Cesare was standing 4 feet from her desk, and Cesare Ferrante had spent his childhood learning to see bruises through makeup because his mother had worn them the same way, hidden in plain sight, like secrets pressed into skin. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was bright and slightly breathless, the voice of a woman who had learned to cover damage with cheer the way she covered bruises with powder. "The mail is sorted. You have 3 calls to return. And I made espresso." Cesare did not look at the mail. He looked at the bruise on her cheekbone the way a doctor looks at a symptom, not with shock, but with recognition. "Who?" he said. One word, delivered without inflection, without warmth, without anger. Just the word itself, clean and sharp, like a blade placed on a table. Mireille's brightness faltered. She touched her cheek involuntarily. "I walked into a cabinet door," she said. "It was dark and I was not paying attention. You know how clumsy I am." She laughed. It was the worst laugh Cesare had ever heard. It had the shape of a laugh, but none of the substance, the way a scarecrow has the shape of a person, but nothing inside that breathes. "Mireille." He said her name with control, with precision, but beneath the control there was something that made her stop laughing and look at him. Not pity. What she heard in Cesare's voice was fury. The quiet, compressed, underground kind. The kind that does not explode. The kind that waits. "I walked into a cabinet," she repeated. But her voice broke on the last word. The way a branch breaks when it has been bent too far. Not with a clean snap, but with a slow, fibrous tearing. Cesare sat down across from her. Not at his desk, not in his office. He pulled a chair from the hallway and sat down across from her small desk, the way a man sits when he is not going anywhere until something true is said. The silence lasted 2 full minutes. In a house where silence usually meant danger, this silence meant something different. It meant space. It meant you can speak when you are ready, and I will be here when you are. "His name is Nunzio," Mireille said finally. Her voice was flat now, emptied of performance. "He lives in the apartment below mine. We were together for a few months. I ended it because he frightened me. The way he held my arm when we argued. The way he stood in doorways so I could not leave a room. Small things that were not small. I ended it 4 months ago. But he has a key. My landlord gave it to him when we were together and he will not return it. He comes into my apartment when I am not there. He moves things so I know he has been there. A cup in a different place. A drawer left open. A chair turned to face the door. And last night he was waiting inside when I came home." She pressed her palms harder against the desk. Her knuckles went white. "He said, I belong to him. He said no one else would want me. He said I am too broken, too clumsy, too stupid to survive without him. And when I told him to leave, he hit me. Once. Here." She touched her cheek. And then he walked out. As if he had done nothing more than switch off a light. Cesare's right hand had closed into a fist so tight that the tendons stood out along his wrist like cables on a bridge bearing too much weight. "Have you called the police?" he said. "The police?" "I called them the second time he came into my apartment. They told me that because he had a key, it was not breaking and entering. They told me it was a domestic matter. They told me to change my locks. I cannot afford to change my locks. I cannot afford to move. I have this job, and I have my apartment, and I have a door that a man can open whenever he wants. She wiped her eyes quickly. I am sorry. I should not be telling you this. You are my employer. This is not your concern. I am sorry. Stop apologizing, Cesare said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of something much louder. Because they were not a command. They were a correction. He was telling her that she had done nothing wrong, that the apology itself was a symptom, the reflex of a woman who had been taught that her pain was an inconvenience to others, that the appropriate response to being struck was to apologize for bleeding. You did nothing wrong, he said. The man who hit you is the one who should be sorry, and he will be. The last 3 words changed the room, because those 3 words spoken by Cesare Ferrante did not mean what they would mean if spoken by an ordinary man. They meant something that had weight and consequence, and the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had made a promise to his mother's memory and had never once broken it. Go home today, he said. Lock your door. If he has a key, put a chair under the handle. Do not open the door for anyone tonight. Tomorrow, your lock will be different. And this man will not come to your apartment again. How do you know that? Because I know what he is. And men like that only have power when they believe no one is watching. He paused. Someone is watching now. He walked into his office. He closed the door. And through the heavy walnut, Mireille heard him pick up the phone and say 2 words. Varro. Come. Mireille went home that evening to an apartment that felt different than it had that morning, not because anything inside it had changed, but because something outside it had. She locked the door. She wedged a kitchen chair under the handle. She turned on every light, because darkness in an apartment that a man could enter at will was not darkness. It was a hiding place for someone else. The apartment was small, a single room with a kitchen alcove and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The bed was narrow. The sheets were clean because Mireille, like her mother before her, believed that no matter how bad things were, you could still sleep in clean sheets, and that small act of order was a way of telling the chaos that it had not won everything. She thought about what Cesare had said. Someone is watching now. She thought about the way he had sat across from her at her small desk, not behind his own desk, not from a position of authority, but across from her, at her level. She thought about stop apologizing, and how those 2 words had felt like a hand reaching into her chest and gently unclenching something that had been balled up for years. She thought about her mother, about Hortensia's hands, always sewing, always mending. And she thought about what her mother had said to her once, on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a needle pulling thread through a hem. You do not have to earn the right to be safe, Mireille. Safety is not a reward. It is what you start with. Anyone who makes you feel that you must earn it is stealing something that was already yours. She had not understood that sentence when her mother said it. She understood it now. She lay down on the narrow bed. She pulled the clean sheets to her chin. And for the first time in 4 months, she did not listen for the sound of a key in the lock. She slept. Fully, deeply, the way she had not slept since Nunzio had first let himself into her apartment and stood in the dark beside her bed, watching her breathe, and then left without a word. She had found his cigarette ash on her nightstand the next morning, and the knowledge that a man had watched her sleep without her consent had broken something in her relationship with the dark. She had slept with the lights on for 16 weeks. Tonight, she turned them off. The next evening, Mireille arrived at her apartment building after work to find her front door fitted with a new lock. The old one had been removed entirely. In its place was a heavy steel deadbolt, the kind that required a key from the outside, but turned with a thumb latch from within. 2 keys sat on the mat in a small envelope with no writing on it. She turned the new deadbolt from the inside. The sound it made was solid, dense, the sound of metal, meeting metal with absolute conviction. The sound of a door that could not be opened by anyone she had not chosen to let in. She stood there with her hand on the lock and felt something move through her body that was not relief exactly, but something with deeper roots. The feeling of a woman who had been holding her breath so long she had forgotten she was holding it, and who had just been reminded that breathing was an option. She sat on the floor with her back against the locked door and she cried. Not the way she cried when she dropped things or when the espresso came out wrong. She cried the way you cry when something that has been pressing against your chest for months is suddenly, inexplicably, lifted. She cried until she was empty, and then she sat in the silence and listened to the sound of nothing. No footsteps in the hallway, no key in the lock, no chair moved, nothing. Just the quiet hum of a building at rest and the steady, faithful click of a deadbolt holding its position. Mireille never asked Cesare what had happened with Nunzio. She did not need to. The evidence arrived in the form of absence. Nunzio Pirata simply stopped. He stopped coming to her door. He stopped appearing at the end of her block. He stopped calling from blocked numbers at midnight. He stopped existing in the geography of her daily life, as completely as if someone had taken an eraser and removed him from the map. She heard through her neighbor that Nunzio had moved. Suddenly, without explanation. His apartment had been emptied in a single afternoon. A van had arrived. 2 men had carried out the furniture. The landlord had received 3 months of rent in an envelope slid under his office door with no return address. There was an understanding between Mireille and Cesare that some questions are better left as shapes in the dark, visible enough to know they are there, obscured enough to live with comfortably. Margaret Vitelli arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She was a lawyer, 53 years old, with silver-streaked hair and a handshake that could crack a walnut. She had been sent by Cesare, though she never said his name. Her specialty was housing law and tenancy disputes, and she understood Mireille had a situation with a former partner who had been given unauthorized access to her residence. Within a week, Margaret had filed a formal complaint against the landlord for distributing a key without written consent. She had filed a restraining order against Nunzio, based on Mireille's account of the surveillance and the assault. She had contacted a victims' advocacy organization that assigned Mireille a caseworker, a woman named Brigida, who said, on their first meeting, "You are not the first woman to sit in that chair and you will not be the last, and I need you to know that none of this was your fault." Brigida said it the way Cesare had said, "Stop apologizing," with the weight of someone who understood what the words actually meant and what it cost to hear them. The restraining order was granted in 12 days. A judge reviewed the documentation, the police report that had been dismissed as a domestic matter, the testimony of the neighbor who had seen Nunzio entering the building at unusual hours, and the medical note from the clinic where Mireille had gone the morning after, telling the nurse she had walked into a cabinet door. The same lie, the same inherited language of survival. Nunzio Pirata was prohibited from coming within 200 meters of Mireille's residence, workplace, or person. He had already relocated to a town 40 kilometers south and had no apparent intention of returning. She did not ask why. Some rivers, she was learning, flowed in directions you could not see. At the compound, things shifted. Mireille's espresso improved to the level of drinkable, which represented a significant achievement. She stopped tripping on the conference room threshold, though Tadeo's yellow tape remained because Tadeo Luca did not remove things and no one was brave enough to suggest he should. She learned which phone calls to put through immediately and which to handle herself. She began to notice things about Cesare that his men could not see. The way he paused at the window every evening at 6:15 and looked at the lemon trees. The way he turned Silvio's photograph face up on his desk every morning and face down every evening. the way he spoke to Agnese with a softness that existed nowhere else in his vocabulary, and she noticed the fountain. She asked Agnese about it one afternoon while helping wash dishes, a task not in her job description, but one she had taken on because standing beside Agnese at the sink felt like standing beside her mother at the sewing table. Why he not fixes the fountain? Mireille asked. Because the fountain was his mother's. Pietrina loved that fountain. She would sit beside it on summer evenings and listen to the water. When Cesare took over the house after Silvio died, the fountain broke within a month. An easy repair. But he would not fix it. Why not? Because if it runs again, it will sound like her. And he is not ready to hear her. Mireille understood. She still had her mother's sewing kit in a box under her bed, and she had not opened it in 2 years because the smell of the thread was Hortensia's smell, and opening the box would be like opening a room where her mother was still sitting, still alive in the particular way that smells keep people alive long after everything else has let them go. Some things are not broken. They are just waiting. 5 months after the day she broke the photograph, Mireille walked into the compound and found a small package on her desk. It was wrapped in brown paper. No card. No label. Inside was a wooden picture frame, hand-carved, and dark wood, with a pattern of lemon branches running along the edges. On the back, in small letters burned into the wood, were the words, "For the pieces you gathered." She brought the frame to his office. He was sitting behind the walnut desk, reading, and his glasses on, which was the only context in which Cesare Ferrante looked like an ordinary man. "Thank you," she said. "The photograph needed a proper home," he said. Mireille walked to the credenza. She placed Silvio's photograph into the new frame. It fit perfectly. She set it upright in the exact spot where it had stood before she knocked it over. Cesare looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at Mireille. "My mother would have liked you," he said. 5 words. But they carried the weight of everything he had never said about Pietrina, about the trembling hands, about the woman at the kitchen sink saying we are fine while her face told a different story. They carried the weight of a man who had sealed a hallway shut and was now standing in it, finding that the hallway was not as frightening as he remembered. Mireille's eyes filled. She did not wipe them. "I think she would have liked you too," Mireille said. It was a guess. But she knew about mothers who worked with their hands and mothers who trembled, and mothers who told their daughters that safety was not a reward. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who recognized another woman's fingerprints on a man's soul, that Pietrina Ferrante had left something inside her son that no amount of power or silence could erase. Cesare took off his glasses. He folded them. He placed them on the desk. And then he did something that no one in the Ferrante compound had seen in more than a decade. He smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, a real smile, the kind that starts at the mouth and travels to the eyes and does not stop until it reaches somewhere deep behind the wall, where a boy who once hid behind a sofa and pressed his face into the fabric and smelled lavender, finally, after 49 years, stood up. 1 year later. The compound sat on its hillside the way it always had, stone and bougainvillea and lemon trees, and the faint smell of rosemary on the sea breeze. But things were different now, in the ways that mattered. There was a woman at the desk outside the conference room who had been there for over a year, longer than all 7 previous secretaries combined. She answered the phone without trembling. She maintained the filing system with precision. She no longer tripped on the conference room threshold, though Tadeo's yellow tape remained in place because no one in the house was brave enough to suggest it should go. Mireille Catano had changed in the ways that people change when they are no longer afraid. Her hands still trembled occasionally when she was tired. She still knocked things over with a frequency that defied statistical probability. But the trembling was different now. It was not the trembling of a woman bracing for impact. It was the ordinary trembling of a body that had been through something and was slowly teaching itself that the something was over. She had enrolled in evening classes at the university in Catania. Not veterinary science. Not yet. But biology. The first step on a staircase she had abandoned 3 years ago, and was now climbing again with the particular determination of a woman who had been told she was too broken to climb anything, and had decided, quietly, to prove the world wrong. The deadbolt on her apartment door was the same one that had been installed the morning after she told Cesare about Nunzio. She had never changed it. She had never needed to. On a Tuesday in October, exactly 1 year after the day she had broken the photograph of Silvio, Mireille arrived at work carrying a small paper bag. She walked through the courtyard. She passed the fountain. And she stopped. The fountain was running. Water moved through the carved stone column and fell into the basin in a thin, steady stream that caught the morning light and broke it into small, bright pieces. The sound it made was quiet, not dramatic, just the gentle, continuous murmur of water doing what water does when it is allowed to move again. The kind of sound that fills a space without crowding it. The kind of sound that makes silence feel less like emptiness and more like peace. Mireille stood beside the fountain and listened. She did not know when it had been repaired. She did not ask, because she understood what the running water meant. It meant that Cesare had decided he was ready to hear his mother again. It meant that some things that are broken do not stay broken, and that the people who wait to fix them are not waiting out of weakness but out of reverence for what the fixing will require. She walked upstairs. She set the paper bag on Cesare's desk. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside was a small ceramic cup, hand-painted from a shop in Bulgaria that sold pottery made by local women. The cup was glazed in deep blue with a pattern of lemon branches around the rim. "For your espresso," Mireille said, "so you can stop drinking it from those terrible office cups." Cesare held the cup. He turned it in his hands. He looked at the lemon branches painted on the rim, and something in his face moved. Something that had no name but that lived in the same place where the boy behind the sofa had finally stood up. "The fountain is running," she said. "Yes, it sounds beautiful." Cesare looked out the window at the courtyard. The water caught the light. The bougainvillea moved in the breeze. Somewhere in the kitchen, Agnese was singing something low and tuneless, the way she always did when she thought no one was listening. "It sounds like her," he said. Mireille nodded. She turned and walked to her desk and sat down and began sorting the morning mail, and the ordinary sound of paper and envelopes filled the hallway with the quiet proof that she was there and that she was staying. Down in the courtyard, the fountain ran. The water fell into the basin and overflowed slightly at the edges, the way grief overflows when it is finally allowed to become something else. Cesare poured espresso into the blue ceramic cup. He took a sip. He sat back in his chair. The espresso was still not perfect. It was slightly too sweet and slightly too strong. But Cesare drank it all. Every drop. The way you drink something that was made by someone who showed up every day and did not quit, and bled on your marble floor, and gathered the pieces of something precious without being asked, and handed them back to you without expecting anything in return. He set the cup down on the walnut desk. Through the window, the fountain sang its small song. Through the hallway, Mireille sorting mail. Through the kitchen, Agnès humming. Through the lemon trees, the wind. And somewhere behind the wall, in the hallway where a boy had hidden and a mother had whispered, "We are fine," and a promise had been made to never look away, the walls came down. Not all at once, not with a crash, but slowly, brick by brick. The way things heal when they are given enough time and enough reason and enough cups of imperfect espresso made by trembling hands. The hallway became a room. The room became a house. And the house, for the first time in 49 years, had a door that was open. Not because the world outside had become safe, but because the man inside had finally remembered that his mother's voice, carried on the sound of running water, was not something to hide from. It was something to come home to.